It's become a quiet, unsettling hum in the background of our lives. This question of whether our system is just evolving or actually collapsing. But, when you look at the data, the hum becomes a siren. Transparency International just released its 2025 Corruption Perceptions Index, and the global picture is one of stagnation. But for the United States, it's much worse. We've hit a historic low, dropping to 29th place out of 182 countries, with a score of 64. This isn't just a bad report card, it's a measurable decay of the very institutions that were supposed to be the bedrock of democracy.
Hold on, a score of 64 and a rank of 29th, while not something to celebrate, still places the US in the top tier of nations globally. I think framing this as the siren of collapse is a bit dramatic. The fact that an organization like Transparency International exists, that we are having this very conversation based on its index, proves that the mechanisms for accountability and transparency are still functioning. It feels more like a wake-up call for reform, not a eulogy for a dead republic.
But it's the trend line, Mia, and what that trend enables. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The historian, Sir John Glubb, laid out a theory back in 1976 that great empires have a surprisingly consistent lifespan of about 250 years, and they all end in what he called an age of decadence, defined by a love of money and a loss of any sense of public service. In 2026, the United States hits that exact 250-year mark. When you pair that historical pattern with a tangible decline in institutional integrity, it suggests this isn't an accident. It's a symptom of a late-stage disease. It's the slow, quiet shift from the rule of law to the rule of man.
I find those neat historical cycles a little too convenient. It's like political astrology. It ignores the unique resilience of modern democracies. But let's set aside the 250-year clock for a moment. You mentioned the rule of man. What does that actually look like on the ground? Because for most people, the law still feels like the law.
It looks like economics being used as a weapon. This isn't just about politicians. It's about the institutions they control. We are seeing what can only be described as a top-down harvest of wealth, facilitated by the very bodies meant to ensure stability. Look at the Federal Reserve. Research from the Journal of International Money and Finance is clear. Policies like quantitative easing disproportionately benefited the wealthy who own assets. This isn't a trickle-down effect, it's a siphon-up effect. And you see the human cost in cities like San Diego, where a six-figure salary of $100,000 barely covers rent and gas. That is a form of inflationary robbery, a quiet liquidation of the middle class.
Okay, the economic strain on the middle class is absolutely real and deeply concerning. No one denies that. But to attribute it all to a deliberate harvest by a politicized Fed is a huge leap. Those same studies and many others point to a complex web of factors. Skyrocketing housing prices driven by local zoning, shifts in educational attainment, the decline of unionization. To ignore all of that and just blame the Fed feels like you're searching for a single villain in a story with a dozen antagonists. The problem is real, but the cause is far more complicated than a shadowy plot.
But that's exactly where the institutional decay becomes so dangerous. When the Fed is perceived as being under political influence, its actions stop being seen as neutral economic tools and start being seen as instruments of class liquidation. It destroys public trust. When the rule of law erodes, your retirement account isn't a number you own. It's just meat on someone else's chopping board. That's the real-world impact.
But the narrative of imminent collapse completely ignores the counterforces at play. You cite the decline in one index, but what about the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index? It provides quantitative assessments for 143 countries. The very fact that we are judging America against these global democratic gold standards proves the system isn't broken, it's embattled. The principles haven't been abandoned, we're just falling short of them, and we have the tools to measure how and why. The existence of these watchdogs is evidence of a vibrant, resistant civil society, not a terminal patient.
Mia, you're using the WJP index as a shield, but if the scores are falling, the shield is cracking. Reporting on a fire doesn't put it out. It's just documenting how fast the building is burning down. And this idea of resilience is exactly what allows the decay to happen quietly. Everyone assumes the system will self-correct, right up until the moment it can't.
It's not just reporting, Jingguo, it's the framework for repair. If we were truly in a collapse, we wouldn't have a WJP index or a public debate, we would have silence. The noise is proof of life. And this brings me back to your 250-year myth. More rigorous theories, like the structural demographic theory from scholars Jack Goldstone and Peter Turchin, argue that collapse isn't driven by a calendar. It's driven by specific identifiable factors, rising elite competition and extreme internal inequality. The good news there is that if collapse is caused by policy failures, it means the situation is reversible through better policy.
So, your argument is that things are bad, but they could be fixed. I'm arguing they are bad. Because the people in power are actively breaking the tools needed for the fixing. Look at the tech CEOs. We used to see them as titans, challenging the status quo. Now, we see them learning to kneel. You have powerful figures who go from publicly criticizing a political leader to privately complying because they know their company can be destroyed overnight by a regulatory whim. That's not navigating a complex landscape. That's submitting to a new king.
That's a powerful image, but it's not the full picture. It's not kneeling, Jingguo. It's negotiating. Every industry lobbies when the rules of the game change. Right now, Europe is in a massive enforcement phase with its Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. Tech companies are in a constant, high-stakes battle over antitrust legislation. If power were absolute, as in your new king scenario, there would be no lobbying. There would only be decrees. The fact that they are fighting, spending billions to influence policy, shows that power is still being contested. It's messy, but it's not a settled autocracy.
Okay, I'll admit, Mia, the fact that we can still cite these indices and that these fights are happening in public means the foundation isn't totally dust yet. The watchdogs are still barking. But I would argue we are in the most dangerous phase, the one Anne Applebaum warns about, where the forms and language of democracy remain, but the substance is being systematically hollowed out from the inside. We have the vocabulary of a republic, but the grammar of an oligarchy.
And I have to concede, Jingguo, that when you bring it back to the economics, the San Diego rent example, the widening chasm, it shows that for the average person, the rule of law can start to feel like an abstract luxury they can't afford. If the middle class is financially liquidated, then the resilience I'm talking about has no one left to defend it. The system can't be resilient if its citizens are broken. We both agree that the influence of money and the staggering inequality are the core sickness. We just disagree on whether it's a chronic illness or a terminal one.
Exactly. So maybe the real question isn't whether the system is collapsing or adapting, but what it's adapting times into asterisk. If the rule of law is now just a strategic negotiation for the wealthy and powerful, can we even call it a democracy anymore? We've moved from an argument about inevitable decline to a realization that this is all being driven by policy failures we can see and name. The trajectory isn't destiny, it's a choice.
Which leaves us with the most critical question. Is all the noise and friction we feel today the sound of a system fighting for its life, a sign of its inherent strength, or is it the sound of the engine finally seizing up? And for the person struggling to pay their rent, does any of this debate over indices even matter when their own financial stability feels like it's been placed on a chopping board?